Committee, this is good for my trial, just, I helped Bob in the transportation yesterday, and that just worked so much better when I implicated her to be early on.
We're all going around here.
This will be a learning experience for me. I'll see how much downtime I've got. I'll see if I can do both of them at the same time. But you know what?
Here's the thing, I'm here to help, I'm here to help solve problems.
Bob, the transportation stuff, he was stopping the meeting while he did it. That just makes the meeting go. Eric, he looks at it in real time. You really think that's a big guy? I think you do.
Shortly after the meeting. Sometimes that still has to be done. Minutes come up during the meeting.
I hadn't tried to talk to him. What you said, I called him. What is it? Interviews are Friday. Yeah, I haven't tried to catch him. I've got a pretty busy morning. I've got rules. I believe you're about 30 to the rules, and I've got appropriations after that. So
We don't always
I can try. Because everybody today. To get things done, you know? I mean, we get something, it'll take about 30 minutes after the use, you know? Yeah, it's time. I'll try to talk to him today. I'll try to find, I got one time now.
I've been here before.
I
I saw you down in your office.
This number and that
Certain language that I don't know. I trust you, Paul.
I trust you.
Well, I'll leave by 8:30, I've got rules.
So I guess Patrick's here, sit over there.
These are you, sir. Good. Sub1.
3 is a charter bill. It amends the City of Waynesboro charter to authorize any person aggrieved by a real estate assessment made by the assessor of real estate to have the right to a hearing before the city assessor and to apply for an appeal before the Board of Equalization. The bill allows the city council to choose a date and time to meet for its July organizational meeting following an election. The bill also authorizes an ordinance wherein the city is the recipient of money, funds, or a grant to be passed upon one consideration of the city council instead of 2 years required now, and for other ordinance or resolutions having the same effect as ordinances. This request comes from the city, obviously, and they did advertise and conduct a public hearing, held a meeting where they passed their resolution in support of it.
Thank you, Elder Bell. Any questions from the subcommittee? Is there anyone in the audience who cares to speak to the bill? Report. Have a motion and a second to report the bill. Okay. Vote on electronic voting board. Elder Bell, the subcommittee meeting, 5-0.
Thank you.
Report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Don't think we need to be there Friday morning.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Quinn. Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You have to do better than that. Good morning.
That's as good as it gets.
I've had 2 cups of coffee.
Okay, you have 2 bills?
Yes, sir. Yeah. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I do have 2 bills, and I'm going to do the one with the charter for Richmond City 2052. Yes.
On the
So,
table.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have this amendment in the nature of a substitute that I'd like to get before the committee. The amendment was necessitated by the lack of clarity in the original drafting regarding absentee ballot deadline. And so the city of Richmond is requesting a charter change to conform its provision for deadlines for voter registration and absentee balloting for runoff elections to the same provision in the state code of Virginia. The current charter has no provision, number 1, for voter registration deadline for absentee ballots when there is a runoff, and then for the office of the mayor, nor does it have a deadline for absentee ballot when there's a runoff for the office of mayor after a special election. So the lack of provision in the charter, it has not been tested, and so we just want to make sure that it's in line with the state in case, the code of Virginia, in case something happens.
Very good. We need to get the substitute,
So move substitute. Second.
Move the second. Those in favor, aye. Those opposed, nay. Okay, questions from the panel members for Elder Quinn? So you're essentially aligning up with the state code?
Yes, yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Is there anyone in the audience who care to speak to the bill? Or against? Please step forward and identify yourself, please.
Good morning, I'm Kirk Showalter, the General Registrar for the City of Richmond. This bill was brought at our request because we have managed to avoid 2 runoff elections following the office of mayor so far, but I would prefer not to go into a third situation where we might be open to question and litigation, given that there are no existing deadlines for that particular type of office.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Anyone else? Is there a motion?
Move your report. Second.
A motion is second to report the bill. We'll vote on the electronic voting board. Bill, if you're,
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
second bill.
All right, Mr. Chair, House Bill 2051. It is a bill looking at addressing some challenges that may come about with cemeteries and just trying to establish guidelines. But before I do that, I do have an amendment on line 146. I think, Alan, do you have?
Jeff, I have 3 amendments
Okay, all right, you have three, okay, I'll do it.
Technical,
Okay,
Mr. Chairman, line 146, after the word lax, strike the word clearly and insert archaeologically. And then on line 147, after professional, these are purely technical, changing, apparently there's two spellings of archaeological, and the preferred spelling, instead of what's in the bill, so line 147, after professional, strike archaeological and insert archaeological with a different spelling. And the same amendment on line 151, after required, strike archaeological and insert archaeological.
Do I have a motion on amendment?
Move.
Motion, second. Second. Those in favor of the amendments, aye? Aye. Those opposed, nay. Okay, we have the bill as amended, technical amendments only.
all right.
Yes, ma'am,
All right,
proceed.
thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, House Bill 2051 is a way of just giving guidelines to, in terms of how to move forward in case there is a, unidentified graveyards or grave sites, on property that may be developed, that's being developed or proposed to be developed, to make sure that if you stumble upon those things, that, there are some guidelines to help you move forward in terms of what you do with it. And so the bill allows localities to adopt ordinance requiring certain research to be done which will identify cemeteries that are on that particular property. It also set forth the guidelines requiring research in those local property records dating back to at least 1900 or 1850. The record exists to identify a cemetery on the property prior to the approval of the development of it. And it also just, the ordinance may allow for the removal and the burial of the remains, but also for an archaeological delineation. It establishes a 25-foot wide buffer around the cemetery. It asks that if that happens, that it provides access for pedestrians, those particularly who may be interested in providing the perpetual care. And it's basically give guidelines to what and buffers as to providing for that particular site, if it is identified. And I went to Monticello and they stumbled upon some property. What they did, they put a fence around it. They have access for, again, for visitors, for folks who may have been identified to be connected with that particular burial site. And it's just a way, again, to protect the integrity of the site if it is identified.
Thank you. Questions from subcommittee members? I have a few delegate McLean.
Mm-hmm.
On line 146,
146, mm-hmm.
the word contains. Out in the countryside, one often doesn't know.
Right.
How do we
Right.
know?
And that is one of the challenges. We don't know. And so if they don't know, first of all, you have to do your due diligence with going to the records. You know, the locality need to also look at the particular property to see if there's any, you know, if anyone has said there may be a cemetery there. So do your due diligence there. And if nothing is found, and what is happening, people are stumbling upon these particular properties and or these particular sites. So if it's stumbled upon, then these are the guidelines to move forward, rather than to just go in and you stumble upon it and then be dismissive of it. It is, you know, there are some things that need to be done. And so this is, we don't know, but we are identifying more and more, and we need some guidance in moving forward.
And on line 153,
Mm-hmm.
conveyed to an appropriate entity.
Mm-hmm. For perpetual maintenance.
Understand. I personally am aware of many
Are you?
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 5 graves, nothing more than tract of land.
Mm-hmm.
They're known,
Right.
nobody knows who they are.
Yeah.
So there's no family or no entity that I know
Well, the other, what else is going, the other thing that's going on, people are stepping up and say, and even localities, if these cemeteries are identified, they're stepping up, nonprofit organizations, localities, to say, you know what, we need to, now that we have identified the sacred place, the sacred ground, then what is expected of us? And this is what this bill helps to do, to help guide them in terms of addressing it.
I understand your comment, but you can't convey to an entity that you don't know who is.
Well, I understand.
Delegate McQuinn, I mean, these are permissive, not mandatory
Right,
requirements, as I
right.
understand.
May, yes,
May,
may,
okay.
not shall.
It's just true line on, well, the title optional provisions, except.
And Mr. Chair, there is someone here from the Department of Historic Resources who have been this work all of the time, and so they have also had stumbled upon property.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
you know, just for guidance, she's not here representing the state, but for guidance, we could probably talk with her and see what they have done in the past as.
We'll hear from her in a minute.
Okay,
on
all right,
that
thank you.
problem. I had a couple more questions.
Okay.
It's my understanding under state law, that any cemetery on the property, family members, descendants can access that. And so access is not really a problem, in that sense. Now, there are cases where if that old cemetery is located in the middle of a pasture, then gates and so forth, you know, there has to be some give and take and accommodation between the property owner and whoever wants to visit the cemetery. This bill's also putting if a locality passed this orders, then maintenance is going to be passed on to the current owner of the land or the developer perhaps if the land is being developed. Right? Not the family or the descendant.
Well, the bill is asking, first of all, again, to do your due diligence up the front before the,
Understand that.
yeah. And we had a situation where community folks would say, there's a cemetery on that particular property. And it was sold, localities sold it anyway. And now they had to back up, the developers that purchased the property to address the fact that there were these cemetery, it was a cemetery and these burial places on this particular site. Again, if the localities and the developers who are purchasing the property, you know, let's do this up front, you know, to see in the record if anything's going on. You're not responsible if you don't have knowledge of it. But once you have knowledge of it, someone needs to take the responsibility to, again, protect the integrity of their particular space. And this is a minimum in terms of what they're asking people to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In that instance you mentioned, is the developer doing that voluntarily just because they're doing the right thing, or is there something that allowed the locality to say, hey, you have to go back and do this? Because it sounds like they're doing something.
Out of their goodwill, I think they're looking at it and say, let's do something particular for that particular space, yes. But that's one who said, you know what, this is sacred, let's do something. We can't expect everyone to do that, yes.
Very well. Further questions from the panel? You sort of asked the Department of Historical Resources to comment. I would start with them if you care to comment.
Hi, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Stephanie Williams, Deputy Director of the Department of Historic Resources. We have worked with Delegate McQuinn on the drafting of this bill, and one of the things that we find is problematic is that there is no, as Delegate McQuinn said, not a lot of upfront work that's done in the beginning when developers come in and they buy these plots of land for subdivision. And so they begin their work and then they stumble upon these cemeteries. And so we feel that if there is some due diligence done in the beginning, some kind of deed research, that would go a long way in preventing a lot of the problems that occur when, the shovel is already in the ground.
How much would it cost, to do an archaeological survey of a couple of 100-acre tract of land?
Well, it's not inexpensive.
Not expensive, but not inexpensive.
It's not inexpensive.
Doug,
And, out in rural Virginia, we have some subdivision ordinances in my area. The one in my home county applies to any division of 2 or more parcels. There are obviously some family subdivision provisions that allow a family member to convey a tract off, but they still have to jump through the subdivision ordinance. Would this apply in that situation also, where a father may be giving a tract to a son or a daughter to build something on? Would they then have to jump through the hoops here and get an archaeological survey done if they had an old family grave under their bigger tract?
Now, your question may be a little above my pay
I
grade.
think this is a question for Jeff.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, out in my area, we have a subdivision ordinance in my home county, and it applies to any division of a tract of land into 2 or more parcels. So it's basically inclusive of any transaction breaking out a piece of property. My concern is we have also, there are some provisions in the law for family subdivision ordinances. We have adopted that, which allows, at least one time in the lifetime of the owner to be able to convey off a portion of that property to a family member. My question is, would these provisions apply in that realm? To require potentially a father to do an archaeological survey of a 200-acre tract of land, just so he can convey off a portion of that tract to his son to build a home on?
That's a good question. I mean, a family subdivision is a subdivision of land. It's just exempting from the other subdivision requirements for that purpose. So unless there was an exemption in here, I think that possibly could.
I mean, obviously that concerns me living where I live.
Thank you, ma'am. Anyone else? Tom?
Technical question for Jeff as well. I read this whole section from 142 below to be optional if the locality decides to use it. However, I'm looking at line 144, and if they decide to use this, I believe it states currently that they have to do all 3 of these provisions. They can't just pick and choose. So if number 2 doesn't work for a locality out, in Southwest, they can either use all 3 or not, because it says may include all. I mean, is that technically?
That's how I
you
read it too.
Thank you, ma'am. Anyone else in the audience like to speak either for or against the bill? Further discussion, longer time? Move report. I'll do a plan. Your motion, motion to report has not been seconded, so we will not be reporting your bill. I appreciate you bringing it forward. I think it just needs a little more work.
Okay.
To see you bring it back.
Okay, all right, thank you, sir.
I agree,
All right.
I think though the camera rates are a good issue, we have to be very cautious of subdivisions of properties. So I think you work on it, bring it back, it's a good thing.
Okay, all right, thank you, sir. Okay.
So, personal interest of mine, without getting into complete.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Very well, Delegate Collins.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. This is HB 2465. This is not making new red light cameras. This is taking our existing red light camera and making it a little bit more transparent. In essence, what this does is provides data collection for localities and that the public can utilize. It's going to be helpful in determining crash data and also in designing new road designs and things of that nature. So it's just basically saying everything's got to be made public from the data that we collect from these red light the red light cameras that are currently in existence. So this is not an enactment of making new red light cameras.
Very well. Questions, Dr. Thomas?
Mr. Chairman, it sounds like the data probably is already existing from these vendors. It's just a matter of getting it out to the public so we can decide if we think this is an appropriate way to keep moving forward.
That is a correct statement, sir.
Yes. Anybody else? Any amendments? Okay. Is anyone in the audience here to speak to the bill? Yes, ma'am, would you identify yourself, please?
Yes, sir. My name is, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Martha Mead, I represent AAA. We strongly support this bill. Of course, red light running crashes are some of the deadliest crashes, the T-bone crashes. And we know that effective, red light cameras are a very effective deterrent and an aid to law enforcement. We surveyed Virginia drivers several years ago, and 71% also agree that these cameras dissuade red light running. So well-run programs, we believe, reduce crashes, injuries, and fatalities at intersections where the need is properly demonstrated. Some programs across the country, as you all know, however, have not been ethically managed, have resulted in public mistrust, have eventually been shut down. Obviously, when this happens, the traffic safety benefit is lost. As an advocate for motorists several years ago, and this was a project that I did, I sought to review some of the programs in Virginia for their ethical operations, and to help repair public trust. I discovered in some cases there were best practices where these cameras were being used effectively, ethically, saving lives, reducing crashes, and the information was readily available for organizations like mine and for the public. In other cases, however, the information required 3 to 4 to 5 FOIAs, a ream of paper, and ultimately information that I could not use, nor could anybody else have used, to determine the effectiveness of the red light camera and support them as ethically run programs. So this bill, as Delegate Collins says, helps transparency for the cameras, and we ask for your support.
Thank you. Anyone else? Is there a motion?
Report. Second.
Motion and a second report from the voting board. Delegate Collins, Bill 2465. Delegate Collins, your bill reports 5-0.
Thanks, sir.
I know there's no need to be a full committee, Charlie.
Yes, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Right. Next on the agenda.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. House Bill 2740 comes as a request from the town of Cambridge for an update in their charter. And there are several changes that are requested to be made in their charter. It's been a while since it's been updated, so of course, one thing they wanted to do was to reference general grants of power set out in the Code of Virginia, and makes numerous updating and clarifying changes. That's, I think, the normal thing that is done. And the changes that they are making that would be specific to this particular bill, want to stagger the election of town council members. And that's, I think something that every locality wants to do. And also, it extends the council members' term from 2 to 4 years. And you can imagine running every 2 years, what that's like, so he's going to. It's not much fun. I think somebody ought to introduce a bill, not affect you. That's the deal. I'll answer any questions.
Any questions? Anyone in the audience care to speak? Is there a motion?
Report.
Motion and second to report. Those who favor of report to the bill will vote on electronic board. Delegate Wright, your bill reports 5-0. No need to report for item 1 to CC4 committee.
Thank you.
If trouble gets to the bill, I'll tear it over to next week or something. We won't kill your bill without you knowing it. Delegate Cole.
Cole's gone.
I'm sorry. Delegate Ward, you have a sign.
Delegate Ward.
Oh, let's blame it on the LA.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My bill is House Bill 2607, and it is meant to amend the code relating to parking certain large vehicles and residential areas. I do have, an amendment to the bill.
Mr. Chairman, it's House Bill 2607, line 16, after the three brands strike actively. On line 18, after the word areas, insert comma, unless such vehicles are engaged in or preparing to engage in utility or similar service work.
Read that one more time.
Line 18, after the word areas, insert comma, unless such vehicles are engaged in or preparing to engage in utility or similar service work.
Okay.
There's one more.
We got one
Motion
more.
is second to
One more.
Okay. Hold on.
Modular homes.
Okay, so after that last phrase, or similar service work, we're gonna add or engaged in the parking of a manufactured or modular housing unit awaiting placement on a residential lot.
Okay. Okay, questions from any amendments on the table? Got a motion and second for the amendments. Those in favor, aye? Aye. Aye. Those in that, opposed, nay? Okay, the bill as amended is on the table.
All right, thank you. Well, under current law, localities can limit commercial vehicles from parking in residential areas that are adjacent to commercial business areas for no more than 2 hours. These are vehicles with a gross weight in excess of 12,000 pounds or a length of over 30 feet. Current law also includes an exemption of any vehicle that might be waiting to be loaded or unloaded, because waiting to be loaded or unloaded is kind of ambiguous. The city of Hampton has experienced an abundance of large trucks parked in narrow, crowded residential areas for extended periods of time. So we work with the utility companies, Dominion, Verizon, who might be there engaging in or preparing to engage in some official utility work, and also spoke to someone who does modular houses, homes, and they may be parked waiting to unload. So those are exempted. And we just want to make sure that our local police have a course of action to follow if a semi-truck is parked in extended periods in a time in a residential area. Now, I agreed to carry this bill for my city because I experienced this in my own neighborhood, small little community, and there's a big truck that carries cars. We buy and sell, junk cars. And the car this big truck just sits there, and school buses come through, and as I leave my subdivision, that big truck is right there. You can't see when you're leaving. It's very difficult, and it can be dangerous, especially when the school bus comes out and it goes to the main road and the truck is sitting there. The school bus has a difficult time seeing it. So it's really a safety matter, and I don't think any of us really want a semi sitting in your neighborhood. So this gives the city of Hampton, or your city, your locality, the opportunity to address that issue.
See where you're coming from a city, but how about a small town? I mean, there's nowhere else to park
No.
sometimes. Okay. Duncan Thomas.
My question, I know we're talking about commercial vehicles. I don't read that anywhere in here. I was looking to see if maybe the parent section specific limits. The reason I ask is when you're a family of 10, you travel in a 41-foot vehicle that weighs 33,000 pounds. That's how I get around with my family as we're traveling. So I clearly park that in a residential area. I'm just curious if how that would affect motorhome.
Yep, can you help on that question? Anyone in the audience care to speak to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Randy Grumbine with the Manufactured Modular Housing Association. Don't really have to side one way or the other on the bill, but we do appreciate the delegate carrying the amendment to allow us, in the rare occasion that you get to a point you can't finish a job moving onto a property. So that was the impetus for that amendment. So thank you, Delegate Ward.
Yeah, thank you. Next. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. CJ Stolley here on behalf of the City of Hampton. We requested this bill, and to address your concern, if it's possible to put in commercial in front of vehicles, we would be amenable to that. That is what we're trying to get at. We're not trying to get at family vehicles. It's the large semis that are parking in neighborhoods, excuse me, where families really only have parallel parking. They don't necessarily have driveways they can park in, and those parallel parking spots are being taken up by the large semi trucks that are waiting to be unloaded.
Everyone. Ma'am, you stood up? Would you like to?
No, thank you, sir.
Okay.
TJ got it.
Okay. Any further questions for the panel? A motion to report. Delegate Ward, like a second to the motion. The bill needs a little more work, I think, for small towns.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being out this morning. Delegate Cole.
Mr. Chairman, I have House Bill 1776, and what it would do, there is an amendment requested by the fire people, amendment in nature of substitute. Basically, this was put in by request of a constituent, and what they got a situation in Fauquier right now. Tannerite, which is, I guess, the brand name of is two binary explosives. What it is, you have two inert ingredients, then you mix them together and they become explosive. Those are unregulated right now, and it was originally used for target practice. What you do is, especially long-range target practice, you would mix, some of it together, put it in a jar or something, and then, when you hit it with a bullet, it explodes. It's fairly stable explosive, and it's why it's used a fair amount. But what's happened is there are people who are starting to buy large quantities of it, and since it's unregulated, they're using it to do really dumb things like blow up old cars and things like that, large quantities of it. And what's happening in Fauquier is people are setting it off near residential areas. And I have one constituent who's a veteran that suffers from PTSD. And when he hears these large explosives, it rattles their windows and things like that, and it causes him to have problems. Anyways, this is my intent here is just to allow localities to regulate the use of these items near residential areas. Not trying to ban it or anything like that, but I know localities, they can already ban shooting in subdivisions. So I think it's appropriate that they be able to regulate the use of these type of explosives near residential areas. And as I said, there is a substitute requested by the department. I think the fire services people, they're trying to treat it just like they do illegal explosives. I don't, I'm kind of ambivalent about it. I don't have an issue with it, where they would confiscate it. I'm not sure how applicable it is, because my bill only allows for a third-class misdemeanor, and you normally don't arrest people for third-class misdemeanors. You just issue them a citation.
Okay, we need to get the substitute on the table. Now, the difference in your original bill and the substitute.
Well, my original bill was kind of silent about what to do with the, you know, it's silent on what to do with the tannerite. It just says that, you know, any locality, you know, can regulate or prohibit or regulate the use of tannerite or similar to component explosives in or near residential areas. Any penalty for it shall not exceed a third-class misdemeanor. Pretty simple and straightforward. And then, like I said, it's the fire services people that want to treat it like illegal fireworks, where they go in and confiscate it.
Technical question.
Yeah.
This looks like it completely gets rid of that language. I'm not sure if that's your intention.
Was it your intention to completely replace your bill with the recommended language, or to add it to your?
To add it to it.
Okay, that's not what it's right.
All right,
Yeah.
that was where I was headed.
Yeah.
Okay.
So substitute that would be added to the initial bill, the original.
All right, is everybody on the panel, with us now? The substitute is in addition to the regular bill that you reviewed before. Okay. Questions from the panel?
I have a question. You referenced the portion of the ordinances that they can regulate shooting. In those sections, is there any guidance in the state code that defines near or close to residential, or is that in the other sections, is that wide open?
I'm not aware of any. There may be, but you know, if you wanted to, if the committee wanted to put parameters on it, you know, I would certainly consider that a friendly amendment.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's all sorts of different subdivisions, so I'm not really sure what it would be, but.
So, do the jurisdictions, you have that they shall hold the material until final disposition. Do the jurisdictions have the ability to hold this in a safe manner?
I would assume they do, since they can already confiscate illegal fireworks.
A follow-up question, Mr. Chairman? So when they confiscate illegal fireworks, do they hold them, or is it they're considered illegal and then they just dispose of them?
I assume that they would have to hold them until the court, because that's evidence, until the court hearing.
Follow the chair. I'd like to know where these things are gonna be held and what type of safe manner, because of course we run into this type of thing where, I agree with what the concept is, but we're taking explosive materials away and then we're putting them in some facility that we don't have defined, and we don't know if it's gonna be safe, and if there is a collection of this material, does it then put other people in some type of jeopardy?
Personally, I do know, I mean, in a couple of jurisdictions I'm familiar with, one has a facility and one does not, but the one that does not will go to an adjoining jurisdiction or a state facility. We have Bond Sport around the Commonwealth, and they have places that can be used if they need to, so I mean,
I'm just not certain why you need the additional language.
You know, that the additional language is not my idea. That was the fire services people. Like I said,
Yeah, I mean, assuming the locality adopted your original bill and enacted an ordinance of this kind, then upon the issuance of a summons by an officer, they're gonna obviously take into possession the evidence related to the crime. And then they'll be required to maintain that evidence through any appeal period during exhaustion of that. So, I don't understand the need for that.
you'd have to ask the fire services people are here. They can speak to that. That's their.
Similar question. I think once the crime has been completed, these substances are now exploded, so I'm not sure what there's left to gather. Maybe there's more on the property or something like that. I mean,
That's the, you know, that if, you know, once the summons is issued, if there's additional explosives there, that they could be taken into, you know, custody or, you know, for evidence. That, at least that's what my understanding of what it is.
Yes, kind of borrowing from Delegate Thomas, I do have some concerns in the original language about the inner near residential areas, because that seems fairly ambiguous about what that definition is. I know that when we talk about the discharge of firearms, we have very specific definitions about how that is defined, because we've run into some similar situations in Loudoun County. Leaving this open to interpretation, I think, probably opens the door for all kinds of unintended consequences.
And I think, you know, like I said, I'm perfectly willing to consider any parameters the committee would like to put on it, but, you know, it's kind of difficult to say, depending on how much it is, it's how much is close. You know, I mean,
Is there anyone in the audience who care to speak to the bill?
Yes, good morning. Bonnie Atwood. I represent the Fire Prevention Association, and we support the substitute. It was our understanding that the substitute would be the bill and not the prior language. One reason why we asked for that was that it puts the language all under fire code section. It also, if you adopt the substitute only, the new language only, it solves a few problems. For example, defining what is a residential area, because under the fire code section of the Virginia Code, you're not allowed to do certain things like put off these explosives, and it doesn't say where. You're just not allowed to. It just avoids that problem.
well,
Could you cure that by using the language within so many feet of an occupied dwelling, as opposed to?
One could. That's one way to address it, yes.
Okay, call.
well, you know, and I'm not a lawyer, so, but, you know, with just the substitute language, I don't see where the offense is. There's no violation of the law with just the substitute. It says what an arresting officer shall do, but there's nothing to arrest them for with the substitute.
Delegate Reed?
So I think Delegate Campbell was hitting on what I was trying to address, is that there is a part of the code that says that for firearms, within, I can't remember if it's 300 yards or something like that, that is defined as a residential area. And I would think that we would be able to borrow part of that definition to apply here, but I appreciate what you're saying is that depending on the size of the explosion, it might not be sufficiently a big enough radius.
I'm not real interested in trying to rewrite the legislation this morning. Is there anybody else in the audience care to speak? One more meeting.
Would a motion be appropriate to just pass by?
I think so. It seems premature.
For the day?
No,
Till next
still
week.
seems to be, we've got full load next week. I think the right motion would be just make no motion at all, let the bill die. Very well. Liking a motion, bill dies. Thank you, Delegate Cole. Delegate Peace.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I have to admire the fact that that last bill was 1776. I don't know. The Rockets' red glare. Might be too early for me.
Tannerite bursting in air.
Well, thank y'all for accommodating, again, a late start to my bill presentation due to taking the kids to school, so appreciate your indulgence. House Bill 1866, there's a substitute that Mr. Sharp is preparing. Appreciate his help as well.
What's the difference in the substitute and the bill, please?
Well, look, and actually the substitute achieves the original purpose of what was introduced, which I'll describe.
Motion, second, to move substitute. Those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Substitute's on the table.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, a few years ago, I had a bill that was successfully acted upon, and it became law requiring local governments and local school boards to publish their
budgets online. In the same spirit, offered this measure. This substitute is a recommendation, and I put quotes around that, from a joint subcommittee on local fiscal stress, which was established in 2017, upon which I serve. We had a presentation mid-year last year from the Auditor of Public Accounts, Martha Mavredes, and she indicated that it was often challenging to get timely reports of audits of local governments. As you may recall, we've had several localities across the state, Petersburg in particular. We had a presentation about Bristol's challenges at that meeting last year. And it was indicated by the auditor that it was very helpful to have that information on local audits directly reported to her. While the joint subcommittee did not take any legislative action in terms of recommendations, it was the consensus of that body that she was right, that would be a good idea to have that information directly reported to her, and this bill would accomplish that. We want to identify, and one of the purposes of that joint subcommittee is to try to identify local causes of fiscal stress. And certainly when those reports are presented to the state auditor, there can be red flags that are raised earlier in the process, so we don't end up in the situation where we found ourselves with the various localities. And I certainly don't want to disparage them, but we are all in this together as a Commonwealth, and so we want to be able to provide intervention or supports earlier in the processes than what we found ourselves in that circumstance. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have about the legislation. It does have a provision at the end regarding towns, populations less than 3,500, when they voluntarily had an audit prepared, and that audit would also be submitted. But that would be in those voluntary circumstances. I know there's concerns about the subcommittee about smaller towns or localities, so we want to make accommodation provision for that. Delegate Aird also joins me in this. She serves on that joint subcommittee, and I put it before you today. Hopefully you'll act positively on the measure.
Delegate Campbell, you had a question?
The delegate piece, and I appreciate the last line of the deal, that you try to exempt out towns under 3,500, or at least deal with that issue. But your language, I guess, on line 21 requires if an audit's prepared, that it be posted on a website. And there are many towns, some in my district, that are very small. They may electively perform an audit to receive federal or state funds, but they don't have a website. So are you amenable to amending that language to, if the website is available, have it posted on there for towns under 3,500?
I would be amenable to that if that is the circumstance where there are no websites. Certainly we wanted to make provision for, at the end, submitting to the auditor when it's been a voluntary audit. And certainly, if you've got a town that's smaller than 3,500, and I don't want to say this categorically, but your fiscal stress and issues are certainly not going to rise to the level of significance that, say, a city of Petersburg found themselves in. But I would appreciate an amendment. I don't know, Mr. Sharp, if that could be.
In the past, sometimes we've added the language, comma, if such website exists.
Right. Would that satisfy you? I'd be amenable to that.
I think that's a good idea. Is that a motion, Jeff?
Yeah.
Is there a second?
Second.
Yeah, two Jeffs, I'm sorry. Delegate Campbell? If, what's the exact words?
Comma, if such website exists.
If such website exists. Great idea.
This will be on line 21.
Right. After the word website. Okay. Have a motion to amend the bill to that language?
Move.
And a second. Those in favor, aye. Those opposed, nay. Okay, the bill's been amended to take care of that.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I just put this before you as a good government transparency accountability measure. Pretty simple and straightforward. Hope you act favorably on the bill.
Anyone in the audience care to speak to the bill? Okay, a little housekeeping before we do the vote. I want to make sure we don't do it. We need to strike Delegate Aird's bill, I believe, this morning. Okay.
And she had made that request, Mr. Chairman.
Let's vote on this bill, then one final action will be to strike her. Okay, we have a motion to report to a second.
Second.
Second, motion to report as amended. Vote on electronic voting board.
Is it report substitute or?
Substitute,
As amended.
Substitute with amendment.
I'll fix it. That's fantastic.
Okay, 6-0. I now need a motion to strike Delegate Ayers' bill.
So
at
moved,
request.
strike over there, too.
Motion is second. Those in favor of striking Delegate Ayers' bill? Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. I think that does it. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you, appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Additional items.
There you are.
Yeah, I'm
Good to
back
see
there.
you.
I figured
Yeah,
you didn't leave me, so I was
thank you
gonna
for
stay
being
right
here. I
there.
just didn't need you to come, but,
What did you,
education.
Oh,
Wait,
okay.